I'd like to talk about a subject today that relates to the parsha, but first I'd like to give a little background to the subject and then see how it relates to the parsha, which is the idea of Bitachon, of placing one's trust in the Ribono Shel Olam. As we know from Tanakh, we know from Chazal, that this is considered a very, very laudable midah, the idea of Bitachon, relying on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now first let's clarify our vocabulary. Now, there are two words which are closely related. There is Emuna and Bitachon. And the Ramban writes in a little sefer that he wrote called Emuna and Bitachon that the relationship of the two is like the relationship of a tree to its fruit. Emuna is the tree, Bitachon is the fruit. So the fruit testifies to the tree, but there are trees that don't bear fruit. The tree is Emuna. Emuna is propositional belief, the things we believe about God. If a person believes that God exists, if a person believes that God is omnipotent, if a person believes that God is omniscient, all-knowing, then he possesses Emuna. He has propositional belief about God. There are certain things he believes are true about God. That doesn't necessarily mean that he will rely on God. There could be a number of reasons why he doesn't rely on God. He doesn't feel he's deserving. But Emuna he has. Obviously, you can't have Bitachon without Emuna. You can't put your trust in God if you don't believe in God. So therefore, the relationship is like the fruit to the tree. The fruit cannot exist without the tree, but the tree could be a tree that doesn't bear fruit. Bitachon means trust, reliance on God. Now, Bitachon means several things. Number one, it means that we have to rely on God's explicit promises. If God promises something, we know we can count on it. That's pretty much a no-brainer. If God would tell me, I'm going to do such and such for you, so of course you can count on that. It's very interesting. The Vilna Gaon cites a pasuk in Tehillim. We say in Hallow, Tov lachasos b'Hashem mivtayach ba'adam. Now, we have two different Hebrew words for trust. One is lachasos, which also means to trust, to rely. And the other word is liftoach. It's better lachasos b'Hashem, to trust God, than mivtayach ba'adam, than to rely on man. And the question is that what is the point of this verse, and why do we have two different synonyms for trust? So the Vilna Gaon offers the following ingenious interpretation. He says, lachasos is to rely in the absence of an explicit promise. A person relies on his parents, a person relies on his friends, even without a promise. In this context, the word liftayach means to rely on a promise. And now the verse is saying an amazing thing. It is better to rely on God even in the absence of a promise than to rely on a human being even if he made an explicit promise. Now, a human being promises me something, so you figure he's good to his word. It's still better to rely on God even where God has not made a promise than to rely on a human being who has made a promise. But that's the first aspect of Bitachon, is to rely on God's promises. If God makes an explicit promise, you have to rely on that. There's another aspect of Bitachon, which is to rely on God's help even in the absence of a promise. Now this is very tricky. What would the basis of that be? If God makes a promise, okay, God's honest, keeps his word. But if God has not made a promise, what could the basis of Bitachon be? The answer is because we are confident that God loves us. We believe that God loves us. He loves us because everyone loves his own creations. I remember, this goes back many, many, many years, my oldest daughter, who now is the mother herself, but when she was in preschool, so she came home with a project. We were not pleased with the project. I don't know. We were hoping that she'd come home with some arts and crafts thing from the parsha. but her teacher thought that it was more important to talk about recycling. So she came home with a decorated recycling bin, and she comes home with this thing, which is really terrible. And she was probably 4 years old at the time, and she says, "It's beautiful. I made it." Those are her words. Which is the idea that something you made, something you created, is precious to you. Because we are God's works. God made us, every human being, everything in the universe. And therefore, God is concerned, He cares, it's important to Him. And therefore, we can be confident in His love, that He would not do something to abandon us, to hurt us. And to the extent that it is possible, He would want to help us and make sure that we are as well off as we can be. That's the basis of Bitachon. So even in the absence of a promise, the same way that a child, again, relies on his or her parents, we can rely on the Ribono Shel Olam, even in the absence of a promise. Now, this idea that there are two aspects of Bitachon, just to illustrate the point, doesn't require illustration, but to illustrate the point, Rabbi Eliezer Breitowitz discusses this to answer a very difficult Rambam, fantastic Rambam. Now, in last week's parsha, it says that when Yaakov received word that Esav was coming with 400 men, so it says, "Vayira Yaakov ma'od vayetzer lo," that Yaakov was very frightened. He was frightened of Esav. So the Gemara in Maseches Bereshis asks the question, why was he frightened? If you go back to the beginning of the previous week's parsha, Parshas Vayetze, Yaakov has the vision of the ladder, and God appears to him and says, "Hinei anochi imach, I will be with you. Ushmarticha b'chol asher telech, I will guard you wherever you go." You don't need to be scared. There's an explicit promise of divine protection. Why is Yaakov scared? So the Gemara says he was scared, Shema yigroim hachet. He was scared that perhaps he was guilty of some sin, and therefore the promise would not be fulfilled. Which means that Yaakov Avinu feared that perhaps the divine promise had an unspoken condition. Now, God makes a promise. So there wasn't an explicit condition, but there could have been an assumed condition, an implicit condition. That God isn't promising to help just anybody and everybody under all circumstances. If the person is deserving, then I'll protect him. But if the person commits a sin, that could abrogate the promise. So therefore, Yaakov Avinu was scared. Perhaps he committed such a sin, and that the divine promise was conditional, and therefore he wasn't going to be protected. So the Gemara basically says that Yaakov was justified in his fear. He was scared. Shema yigroim hachet. Comes to the Rambam. The Rambam in the Shemaina Prakim, his introduction to Pirkei Avos, says a fantastic thing. The Rambam is talking about a totally unrelated topic. He says that to be a Navi, to be a person to whom God speaks, you don't have to be absolutely perfect. Because one might have thought that God will only communicate with a person who has no faults or always perfect. It's not true, says the Rambam. He says, we find that many of the Nevi'im had flaws. They were imperfect in various ways. And the Rambam goes through a list of 7 or 8 of the Nevi'im and points out their flaws. Points out even Moshe Rabbeinu's flaws. I won't tell you what it was. He says Moshe Rabbeinu had a flaw that he had a temper. He had a temper. That was a flaw. And he says that Yaakov Avinu was a Navi. He also had a flaw. What was his flaw? His flaw was a lack of bitachon, a lack of faith. Because it says in the verse that he was scared of Esav. So it was a lack of faith. Nevertheless, despite this flaw, he was a Navi. God still spoke to him. So it asks Rabbi Eliezer that it seems to be a contradiction to the Gemara. The Gemara says he was justified in his fear. Because maybe he committed a sin. And here the Rambam says it was a flaw. It was a fault. And from this he brings a proof that a person could be a Navi even if he has a fault. So Rabbi Eliezer answers that the Gemara and the Rambam are talking about two different things. The Gemara's question is, why was Yaakov scared? Yaakov was the beneficiary of an explicit promise. God promised. So he had a promise. So why was he scared? On that, the Gemara says that Yaakov thought he may have committed a sin, and that the promise was conditional, and therefore he could not rely on the promise. The Rambam is asking a different question. Granted, there's no divine promise, but there still is an idea of bitachon, of placing your trust in God, even in the absence of a promise. So forget the fact that Yaakov believed that the promise was conditional and he didn't fulfill the condition. Good, so the promise isn't operative. But why didn't he have faith? Even in the absence of a promise. Says the Rambam, it was taka of flaw. It was an imperfection in Yaakov. Which is an amazing thing, which means, and this is what comes out, that a person is justified in putting his faith, his trust in God, even if he has committed a sin. Because that's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says that Yaakov couldn't rely on the promise because he thought that the promise was conditional on his not sinning, and perhaps he had sinned. So Yaakov held himself to be a sinner, to have sinned. And yet, the Rambam faults him for not having bitachon, which means that we are allowed to place our trust in God even if we had sinned. In the same way that children trust their parents, even if they're not perfect children. Right? Or the child can count on his parents, even if he's not been the perfect child. But these are my parents. And God is the same thing. The idea of bitachon, of relying on God, is not only for the tzaddik gomer, for the absolutely righteous person. Even the person who may be guilty of some sin, if he relies on God, God will help him. This is a fantastic thing. This is a fantastic thing. And the only way to understand it, I believe, is by analogy. Let's say a person came to you and said, I need a favor. And you're the only person who can help me. I'm counting on you. And this is a good friend. He says, you would extend yourself for him. Why? Not because he's necessarily deserving. Maybe he hasn't been a perfect friend himself. But to the extent that he counts on you, he relies on you, you'll help him. Now, it's important to understand that bitachon does not mean a certainty that things will turn out the way I would have wanted. Right? That's the mistake. A Baal Bitachon cannot say that I know for a certainty that I'm going to win the lottery. I know for a certainty I'm going to recover from this illness. I know with a certainty. That's not true. The Chazon Ish writes that in the absence of nevuah, in the absence of an explicit prophecy, a person cannot know the future. What bitachon means is, number one, there is no inevitability to the worst case scenario. I am not doomed. Number two, it means there is always hope. And number three, it means that to the extent that it is possible, barring other considerations, God will deal with me in a loving way. There could be considerations that preclude that. Let's say a person taka has sinned, and the person needs a kapara. And sometimes the kapara entails suffering. So, it may be. But barring other considerations, God will treat me in a loving way. That is the idea of bitachon. It's not a certainty. I don't know what the outcome will be. But I know that God will give me a shot. And the truth is, the Chayvus HaLevavos writes that there's really no alternative to trust in God. And this is a very, very important thing. He says, everyone trusts in something. Think about that. Everyone relies on something. There's no person who goes through life without relying on something. There are people who rely on their intelligence. There are people who rely on their money. There are people who rely on their connections. Everyone is counting on something, right? Everyone is utilizing some means of advancing himself. There are some people who rely on God. Now the question is, what is better? What is better? So the Chavis Lababa says a frightening thing. He writes that whatever you rely on, that is what God establishes as the basis for your success or failure. Meaning, if you rely on your money, God says, okay, it's up to your money. Your money will determine your fate. If you rely on your connections will determine your fate. If you rely on your genius will determine your fate. If you rely on me, I will determine your fate. Now the question is, what is the best thing? So I want to point out something which is we have to know. You go to Las Vegas and you gamble. You can win in the short run. But if you play long enough, you will lose. Right? The odds are in favor of the house. It could be a very, very slight difference. 51-49. 52%. But in the long run, if you roll the dice enough times, if you spin the roulette wheel enough times, so the law of averages determines that the number of outcomes will approach the statistical probability, and sooner or later it'll be 51% in favor of the house and 49% in your favor. And a roulette wheel, there are two, right?
From what I understand, overall it's 52% in favor of the house.
See, roulette wheel, there are two, it's half red and half black, except for the two green numbers which are in favor of the house. Now, the point is like this. Life is like that. Now, you can rely on your money up to a point. Or you rely on your ingenuity up to a point. Or you can rely on your connections up to a point. And in the short run, you can succeed. And therefore, you can delude yourself into thinking, you say, I don't need God. I have money, I have connections. But in the long run, you play long enough, the odds are in favor of the house. Right? Sooner or later, money won't help, and connections won't help, and ingenuity won't help. And it's an amazing thing. People have a good run, and they think it'll last forever, and it doesn't last forever. It says, the Ribono Shel Olam, it may seem that in the short run, you're better off relying on something else, but in the long run, counting on it has its benefits. One of the great benefits of relying on the Ribono Shel Olam, the Chavis Labava says, is the peace of mind that you have, the menuchas hanefesh. And the truth is, that after all is said and done, the quality of your life will be more a function of your serenity than of your riches. So when you place your trust in the Ribono Shel Olam, and you know that what you need you'll have, what is good for you you'll have, then you can live a life of menuchas hanefesh, of peace of mind. Whereas if you rely on your money, so the question always is there enough? Will there be enough? Will it be there when I need it? Etc., etc., etc. These are the ideas that are associated with Bitachon. Now, how does it come to the parsha? There's a very, very intriguing maimer of Chazal, right in the end of the parsha. Yosef is in prison, and he's already been in prison for 10 years. And at the end of the 10th year, something happens. There are two of the king's officers, the Sar Mashkim and the Sar Ha'ofim, the chief wine steward and the chief baker, who are in prison for crimes that we don't really know, because they'll tell us that they were derelict in their responsibilities. And they have dreams. And Yosef interprets the dreams to mean that the Sar HaMashkim will be reprieved and the Sar HaOfim will be hanged. And he tells the Sar HaMashkim, listen, that when you are reprieved, when you're freed, put in a good word for me. Put in a good word. Tell Paro that there's a fellow in jail, and he's a good man, he's innocent, and perhaps Paro should have mercy. This is what he says. Kiyim zechartani, if only you would remember me. Kashiyitav lach, when Paro will do good to you. V'asisu noyim odi chesed, and do a kindness. V'skartani al Paro, and mention me to Paro. V'otzeisani min Vayeshev, and take me out of this prison. Ki gunoyiv gunavtim in the eretz Ivrim, I was stolen, I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. V'gam polo asisi mum, I did nothing here. Ki somo asibabor, they put me in this pit. And we know how we got there. Right? False accusation that he had taken liberties with the wife of Potiphar. But I'm innocent, and therefore put in a good word for me. And sure enough, 3 days later, it's Paro's birthday, and his custom on his birthday is that he'd review all the cases, he'd consider pardons, and he pardons the Sarah Mashkim, and he hangs the Sarah Ophim, and it says, V'lo zochar Sarah Mashkim es Yosef, the Sarah Mashkim did not remember Yosef, v'yishkachayu, and he forgot him. So he did not put in a good word.
Why does it say it two ways?
So Rashi says, we'll say another pshat in a few moments, but Lo zochar Sarah Mashkim means he didn't remember him that day, and he forgot him afterward. Meaning, that's it. Nothing happened. Then, 2 years later, Paro has a dream. Paro has 2 dreams, actually, and he can't interpret them. And the Sarah Mashkim wakes up and says, oh, you know, there was a kid with us in prison, a Nar Ivri, a Jewish lad, and he's very good at interpreting dreams, and maybe he can help you. And Yosef is called out of prison, and he interprets the dreams that they foretell the 7 years of plenty, the 7 years of famine, and Paro is enamored with Yosef, and he liberates him and puts him in charge of the food program, and Yosef essentially becomes the viceroy of Mitzrayim and the savior of the country. It's an amazing, amazing thing. But Yosef was in prison 2 years after the release of the Sarah Mashkim. So Chazal are troubled. Why was he there those 2 years? Now, I'll just mention, interestingly, that Chazal do not discuss why he was there the 10 years before. In other words, he was in prison. You make a calculation, you can easily calculate he was in prison for 12 years. He was kidnapped, he was sold when he was 17 years old, and he stood before Paro. The pasuk says he was 30 years old. So that's 13 years. Figure that his time in the house of Potiphar, figure was about a year, let's say. So he was in prison probably about 12 years. So the final 2 years, Chazal give an explanation. We'll see why in a moment. But why was he the first 10 years? So this is what I want to share with you. This is, as an aside, a fantastic Meshech Chachma. This is a beautiful thing. It's like this. He says that Yosef came out of prison, and somehow he was able to become the administrator of the entire country. How did you know what to do? How do you know what to do? A community organizer doesn't know how to run a country. So how could Yosef have known how to run a country? It's a good question. Now the answer is that this prison was not a prison for the lower classes. This was a prison for political prisoners, white-collar crime. You know, Paro, in those days, right, the government was not there to serve the people. The people were there to serve the government, and specifically to serve the king. So when you talk about the king's cabinet, right, the ministers of the king, who are the, nowadays you have ministers. You have the minister of the treasury, the finance minister, and you have the foreign minister, and so on and so forth. In those days, who were the ministers of the government? You had the minister of meat, the Sarah Tabochim. He was the chief butcher. You had the Sarah Mashkim, the chief wine steward. You had the Sarah Ophim, the chief baker. And these were the ministers of government, right? Their job was to serve power. And they were familiar with the etiquette of the palace and the rules and the administration of state. And Yosef was a prisoner in this prison for 10 years. And we know from the Chumash, in the end of this parsha, he had to run out of prison. In other words, he was so beloved to the Sarah Tabochim that he would have free reign. He could go wherever he wanted, talk to whoever he wanted. He wasn't in solitary confinement. And undoubtedly, when they sat around, they talked about their exploits, that we did this, and we did this, and we did this. Imagine you're in a white-collar prison, right, where all the congressmen and all the senators and all the governors who took graft are now sitting in prison, right? And what are they talking about? They're talking about what we did here, and this project, and we did this, right? So you pick up a lot about how to run a state.
Make a lot of contacts.
Make a lot of contacts, right? So Yosef learned how to run the country in prison. So that took 10 years. It takes 10 years to learn how to do these things. So that he had to be in prison 10 years is not a question at all. It was absolutely necessary. It's much like I said. The only question that Chazal are troubled, why the extra 2 years? So the Chazal say an amazing thing. The Chazal say, because he said 2 unnecessary words. He said, Uschartani, remember me, V'hiskirani, and mention me. And because he said those extra 2 words, therefore he was sentenced an extra 2 years. That's why instead of being there 10 years, he was there 12 years. And the Rashi quotes the Medrash that says, Ashrei hageber asher sam Hashem mivtacho. Fortunate is the person who places his trust in God. V'lo pona el rohavim. He did not turn to the haughty people. He didn't count on the haughty people. Meaning Yosef would have been happier if he had not relied on the Mitzviyim who are called Rahavim, who are called haughty. So this was a lack of faith on the part of Yosef. This was a lack of faith. That he put his trust in the Sarah Mashkim, and therefore he was punished to remain in prison extra 2 years. So there's a question which is asked. Many Sfarim ask the question. That Bitachon does not preclude the necessity of Hishtadlut. Meaning you have to trust in God. But you have to exert effort to better one's circumstances. In other words, even a Baal Bitachon works for a living. Even a Baal Bitachon goes to the doctor. Even a Baal Bitachon looks both ways before crossing the street. Or the person has to live in a natural way. As you understand that your success is not a function of your effort alone. You understand that your success is a function of divine providence, but you still have to exert the effort. Why should that be? Why should it be necessary? Why doesn't God hand everything to us on a silver platter? Well, there are different theories. It's interesting, some of the theories come from the same person. In the Mesilas Yesharim, Rabbi Eliezer writes that it's the curse of Adam Harishon. This was the punishment of Adam Harishon of B'zeh hasapecha teich alechem, by the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread. It was a curse. That you can't rely on God to hand it to you on a silver platter. You have to exert effort. By the sweat of your brow you'll eat bread. So from the Mesilas Yesharim, we get the impression this is like a punishment. The punishment is that even though really it all comes from God, but you're going to have to work for it. You can't expect it to be handed to you gratis. In the Sefer Derech Hashem, the same author, Rabbi Eliezer, proposes another theory, which is that Hishtadlus, having to exert effort, is for our honor and for our satisfaction. It gives us tremendous satisfaction and pride that we are able to take care of ourselves. Because if everything was handed to us, it would be demeaning. We'd feel belittled. We'd feel not in control of our own lives. So if God set up a system that despite the fact that everything comes from God, that we have to rely on Bitachon, yet it also is a function of our effort, and therefore we are proud, we feel good about ourselves, that we're able to take care of ourselves and address our own needs. And that's certainly another way of looking at it. But whatever it is, but this is a fact of life. There's no free lunch, even for the Baal Bitachon. A person has to work. A person has to work. Some people haven't realized this yet, right? And they wonder that I'm doing all the right things. I'm davening, I'm learning, I'm placing my trust in God. Like, why isn't it coming true? But maybe there's a string attached, which is you have to do some type of effort. So, what did Yosef do? Yosef is in prison. He's been in prison 10 years. I mean, it doesn't seem this is an amount of effort which is over the top. It's just, one sentence. He says, you're going out, please put in a good word for me. It doesn't seem this should be an impermissible effort. And yet he's punished for it. Doesn't seem to make sense. This is the question that many, many Sfarim ask. So what is the answer to this question? So the Chazon Ish, in a little sefer that he wrote called Emuna and Bitachon, gives a fantastic answer to this question. A very, very important answer. And I'm going to put it in a context by relating it to some other things that we find in Chumash and elsewhere. It's true. We have to exert effort. We have to do hishtadlus in order to achieve our goals. But does that mean that any and every hishtadlus is legitimate? Or are there times that really we should not be mishtadil and we should rely totally on faith? Are there such times? So let me give you an example from Chumash where a great person was criticized for exerting effort, and this is Avraham Avinu. If you go back to Parshas Lech Lecha, so it says that there's a famine in Eretz Yisrael. Avraham Avinu just gets there, all of a sudden there's a famine, and he says, I have to go down to Mitzrayim. But he realizes there's a danger in Mitzrayim, because Sarah, his wife, is very beautiful, and in Egypt, a beautiful woman could be abducted and taken, and if they realize she's a married woman, then they may kill him to do that. So Avraham Avinu, in order to save himself, hatches a scheme that instead of saying that you're my wife, say you're my sister, and this way, if they take you, they won't kill me. To the contrary, they'll wine and dine me in order that I should give permission for you to marry that Egyptian man. Of course, it turns out the Egyptian man who's interested in her happens to be the king himself, and we know the rest of the story. So the Ramban says that Avraham Avinu committed a chet here. He committed a sin. And the Ramban explains it in two ways, but I'll share with you the first way. He says the sin was that he put his wife in a situation of michshol avay. He put his wife in a situation where she was at risk of sin. That someone might have taken her. She was a married woman, and someone might have taken her. And that's a terrible sin for a married woman to be with another man. So what should Avraham have done? What was his choice? I mean, that would be, no matter what he said, she's my wife, she's my sister. Going down to Mitzrayim would have been a danger in any case. Says the Ramban, he should have remained in Eretz Yisrael and rely on God to help him in the famine. Meaning, let's understand this. Let's say Avram would not have been married. He had no wife. He's single. So then he would have been totally justified in going down to Mitzrayim to escape the famine. But because he's married, and now there's a danger to his wife of a michshal avay, so going down to Mitzrayim is not an option. So what should he have done? He should have stayed in Eretz Yisrael. There's a famine. It says, rely on God. Place your trust in God. That's what Ramban says. And by the way, in this sin, the Ramban says is so chomer, so severe, it was this sin for which the Jews were exiled to Mitzrayim and enslaved there. Because the pasuk says, "B'makom hamishpat shama harasha," where the judgment is carried out, that's where the sin was committed. So if we find that the Jews were enslaved in Egypt, it must have been for a sin that was done there, and it was the sin of Rama Avinu. Now the Maharal is very critical of the Ramban on this. The Maharal says that who gave the Ramban the license to say such a thing? We don't find Chazal criticizing Rama Avinu, but the Ramban says it. The Ramban says it. But let's understand the Ramban. What is the Ramban saying? The Ramban is saying that again, if you are in Eretz Yisrael and there's a famine, and you're not putting your wife at risk, let's say you're not married, you have no wife, and the question is, should I stay in Eretz Yisrael and rely on Bitachon, or should I go to Mitzrayim to escape the famine? Says the Ramban, you'd be totally justified in going to Mitzrayim. That would be a permitted hishtadlus, a permitted effort to save yourself from famine, to go to another land. Nothing wrong with that. You're not obligated to stay in Eretz Yisrael and rely on faith. You can go to Mitzrayim and save yourself. But if you're going to put your wife at risk, so that's not an option, so now you have to place your trust in God. Meaning there are situations where the hishtadlus itself involves something sinful, that you have to say, well, if I have no option, I'm in God's hands. There's no hishtadlus I can do. There's no effort I can exert, so I'm in God's hands. As long as there's something permissible I can do, then I should do it by all means. But if there's nothing permissible that I can do, then I have no choice but to place my trust in God. That's what the Ramban says. The Chazon Ish adds something else. The Chazon Ish says that the Baal Bitachon will only exert hishtadlus if the hishtadlus could help. If by natural means, thinking rationally, this is a hishtadlus which could bring about the desired effect. But to do something just because I have to do something, I can't sit and do nothing, I have to do something, so I do something which is essentially grasping at straws, that's not what the Baal Bitachon does. When there is nothing left to do which works rationally, then the Baal Bitachon says, now I'm in God's hands. Now the example I often give of this, and we'll see the application to Yosef in a moment, is when I lived in California, I lived in San Diego. San Diego is right across the border from Tijuana, Mexico. Now in the United States, everything is very regulated, the healthcare system, hospitals, doctors, and so on and so forth, Food and Drug Administration. Tijuana, at least in those days, was like anything goes. So in Tijuana, there were many, many clinics that offered all sorts of quackery for people that were terminally ill. You could have a wheatgrass diet in one place, coffee enemas in another place, and whatever it was. I mean, who came to these clinics? People that were desperate. It was people that their doctors told them in the States that there's nothing more we can do. There's nothing medical science can do for you. So they said, we've got to do something. Can't just sit and do nothing, got to do something. So they went to Mexico, and they entered these clinics and tried these cures. Sadly, they would die there, and the Chevra Kadisha in San Diego often was involved in preparing the bodies for return to their hometowns where they'd be buried. So we became aware of some of these situations. It seems to me, now some people will say that disagree, but it seems to me that there's a point at which a person has to say that there's nothing that medical science can do, I'm in God's hands. To do something which can't work just because I have to do something, maybe bloodletting, leeches, I mean, what do you propose doing? Just to say that you did something? In other words, if there's no causal explanation for this treatment working, then it's not called a hishtadlus at all. Doing it smacks of desperation. It means you're desperate. You're panicking. So you grasp at straws. That a person who's a Baal Bitachon doesn't do. So this hishtadlus is hishtadlus. You exert effort where the effort could help. But if the effort can't help, then you see yourself in God's hands. And I'll just tell you another story that illustrates the idea of being in God's hands. A beautiful story that there was a great guy. He was called the Alter of Novardok. Rabbi Eliezer Breitowitz. He had a network of yeshivas in Russia and later in Poland, 80 yeshivas. And to a great extent, the burden of fundraising fell on his shoulders. So once the situation was very bleak, so he had to go and try to solicit a donation from a very wealthy person in another city. So he took a student along with him. And they arrived by train at that city, and they asked where, they had an address where this person lived, and they told him it's a few kilometers from the train station. So the student said, we should take a carriage. So he says, no, we can't afford to take a carriage. The yeshiva's budget doesn't allow for that. We have to walk, right? And they walked the several kilometers to the person's house, and they made the pitch to solicit a donation. And the person turned them down. Nothing. Didn't get a penny. Nothing. So they leave the house, and the altar in the Marduk said, okay, we have to take a carriage back to the train station. So the student said, I don't understand. He says, on the way here, we had hopes of getting money. And he said we couldn't afford it. Now we know we got nothing, and now we can afford it. So he said like this. He said, until now we were relying on flesh and blood. There's a limit to what a human being can do. So we have to conserve our money. He says now we're relying only on the Ribono Shel Olam. So as we know that the person has let us down. He says if we're relying on the Ribono Shel Olam, he has plenty of money. There's no shortage. We're taking carriage too. Now, I think this story points something out, which is the idea that when we rely on something, there are limits. But when we rely on Ribono Shel Olam, there are no limits. But in any case, this is the idea that a Baal Bitachon, a person with that faith, he's mishtadel. He doesn't act out of desperation. Let's say, for example, you're desperate for money, right? Let's say you need the money. It's the classic illustration. It's Friday. You have no money to make Shabbos. So what are you going to say? You're going to say, I'm going to walk out on Bathurst and look for lost money? Right? That's not a hishtadlus. The likelihood of finding a couple $100 on Bathurst, you can walk up and down. I don't think the likelihood is you'll find that kind of money there. Right? So where do you get money? It says, go to a person who has money to lend, and rely on Bitachon that you'll find favor in that person's eyes. I'll be willing to lend you the money, but like the hishtadlus has to make sense. It can't be something which is nonsensical. I think to a certain extent, counting on winning the lottery is nonsensical. Now, even though we've all been tempted to do it from time to time. I remember when I lived in California once, the California lottery was $100 million. Wow. That was big. It was big, $100 million. And I was visiting a school. And the principal says, do you mind coming with me? I have to go somewhere. No problem. So he had to buy a lottery ticket. Anyway, but what are the chances of winning the lottery? One in a zillion. It's not a meaningful hishtadlus. Again, I've also bought lottery tickets from time to time. I've fantasized what I'm going to do with the money, right? When it gets to 50 million, and I'm in the convenience store, I'll buy a ticket, and then I tell myself, 50 million is just not enough. For my goals, my dreams, 50 million won't do it. But, in any case, that's not a meaningful hishtadlus, buying a lottery ticket, right? It has to be something which makes sense. Buying a lottery ticket, not for fun, like it's fun to fantasize, but to buy it as a serious approach to solving one's financial dilemma, right, is really an act of desperation. So that's what the Chazon Ish says here. The Chazon Ish says that Mitzrayim were Rahavim. They were haughty people. They weren't the type of people who returned favors. So if you would count on them, they would always let you down. And in this circumstance, it's especially so. Imagine this guy. The guy's been in prison for who knows how long himself, right? He gets out just barely by the skin of his teeth. The power releases him, and his friend, who he was thrown in jail with at the same time, is in fact hanged. So he really is the beneficiary of tremendous mercy, tremendous rachmanos, and he's expected to go to power. By the way, if you're already letting people out of jail, I know there's Jewish kid there. Why don't you let him out too? I mean, it's a scheme that just can't work. It is not a meaningful ishtadlus. And therefore, the fact that Yosef did it smacked of desperation. It smacked of desperation. It says that's a breach of Bitachon. That's a lack of Bitachon. If the ishtadlus makes sense, by all means do it. It says, but if there's nothing to do that makes sense, then do nothing. You're in God's hands. Yes?
But the fact that he did remember him 2 years later, isn't that a cause and effect in terms of Yosef making, if Yosef hadn't said anything?
No, it's a totally different thing. You see, what Yosef told him to do is put in a good word. I'm a good guy, right? Says what God did was he created a new scenario. The Pharaoh himself had dreams. Well, if you have dreams, you need a dream interpreter, right? Then it's a no-brainer, right? But that's not what the Saramashim was going to do. Yosef didn't tell him, if Pharaoh ever has a dream, recommend me. He said, just tell Pharaoh that he should let me go, right? That is harebrained, right? If Pharaoh has a dream, right, so of course, who's the better dream interpreter than Yosef, right? But that Saramashim should put in a word, release me for nothing? That can't work. That's an act of desperation. It says that's a breach of Bitachon. The Baal Bitachon never acts out of desperation. That's the tremendous yesod that the Chazon Ish says. I think that it's something that we have to think about deeply, because all too often, whenever we have a problem with it, we got to do something. We got to do something. It says maybe there's nothing that can be done. And if there's nothing that can be done, we have to rely on the Ribono Shel Olam. Right? If there's something that can be done, by all means we should do it. But if there's nothing to be done, then we have to rely on him. Now, there is a vertical that the Sfas Emes says here, which has a tremendous poignance. And listen what the Sfas Emes says. It says, there's a redundancy in the verse. It says, V'lo zochar Saramashkim es Yosef. The Saramashkim did not remember Yosef, Vayeshkachei, when he forgot him. That's an apparent redundancy. It says he didn't remember and he forgot him. So how do you understand that? So Rashi says, V'lo zochar Saramashkim bo b'yom. He didn't remember him on that day. Vayeshkachei, and he forgot him la'achar mikan. He forgot him afterward. So that's the redundancy. That day he didn't remember him and he forgot him subsequently. The Sfas Emes says an amazing pshat here. He says, you have to read the verse this way. The Saramashkim did not remember Yosef, and Yosef forgot the Saramashkim. The Vayishkachehu doesn't mean the Saramashkim forgot him. It means Yosef forgot the Saramashkim. So it means that the Saramashkim did not remember Yosef, and Yosef forgot the Saramashkim. See, the question really is this. The question is that if this was a breach of the obligation of Bitachon, so how do you understand this? So 2 years was his punishment, and after 2 years, what changed? Was the breach rectified? Was the problem solved? Or was it just he paid his dues, and now we can get out? Right? It seems that saying, well, he said 2 words, 2 years, this seems arbitrary. It doesn't seem that if there was a fault, if there was a flaw in Yosef, we would like to understand that Yosef didn't get out of prison until the flaw was rectified. So The way the Sfas Emes understands the verse, that's exactly what it says. In other words, Yosef is in prison. As long as he was counting on him, maybe he'll remember me, maybe he'll put in a good word, maybe he'll do this, maybe he'll do that. So the flaw was not rectified. Yosef was still placing his trust in the Sarah Mashkin. When Yosef said, forget it, there's no point, he's not going to do anything for me, I'm in God's hands, that's when everything changed. And sometimes it could be, I'm frightened to say this, halacha l'maisa, I'm not a novi, I'm not a rebbe, I can't tell the future, but I suspect that there are certain areas in life where we don't receive God's bounty until we give up on getting it ourselves. Now, the one area where this is especially the case is the area of shidduchim. Anybody who has children of marriageable age, right, knows that this is the one area of life where all the efforts you exert seem to be dead ends. There's nothing that makes sense. There's nothing that makes sense. You want to become a doctor, so I understand. You work hard, 4 years in high school, 4 years in university, 4 years in medical school, your internship, your residency, you become a doctor. I understand that. That makes sense. There, your effort yields a result. It bears fruit. Shidduchim, you try this, you try that, you call this person, you call that person, you put out your resume, you do this, you do that. Nothing makes any sense. Nothing makes any sense. And then, all of a sudden, something happens. Can I share with you, it's time for a story? The most amazing shidduch story. Listen to the story. This is my son's uncle. Told me this story. My son got married, and his wife's mother's brother, Uncle Mickey, told the story. Uncle Mickey's a Chevron. He actually was the shadchan as well for my son and daughter-in-law, but it wasn't a fantastic thing. His own son-in-law was my son's best friend, and figured perfect for his niece. But in any case, Uncle Mickey lives in Eretz Yisrael. He lives in Telstone, which is outside of the city, outside of Yerushalayim. This story goes back a number of years. And a fellow comes to him, and Uncle Mickey's a person, a lot of people share their problems with him. And a fellow comes to him, and he says, I want to kill myself, and it's all your fault. He says, you're responsible for my children, my orphans. So he says, what did I do? So the fellow says, I have so many problems, so many troubles. I try to make an appointment to talk to you. You never have time for me. So I have no choice but to kill myself now. It's all your fault. So he says, okay, I'll tell you what. He says, it was the summer. It says, this Friday, we're going to go to the beach at Netanya, the Frum beach. We'll sit in the sun for 4 hours, and you'll tell me all your tzaras. No cell phones, and I'll see if I can help you. The fellow was satisfied. He said not to kill himself. And they go to the beach in Netanya that Friday, and they're sitting out there baking in the sun for 4 hours, and he's telling him this whole peckle, all his tzaras, and whatever. And it's getting late, and it's time to leave, so they get up, and they start walking to wherever they have to walk. And in Israel, on the beach, the people play this paddleball game. I don't know what it's called. And you know what I'm talking about, yeah? And they're playing, and the Swedish people playing paddleball, and one person hits the ball, a very hard ball, and it hits Uncle Mickey right in the head and knocks him cold on the beach. Anyway, he comes to about a couple minutes later. The lifeguard is there, everyone's standing around, and he's all right, he's fine. But the fellow that hit the ball is like, he's totally heartbroken that he hurt him, and he's worried about him. And he begs forgiveness. Uncle Mickey says, no problem, it's okay, I'm fine. He says, no, you don't forgive me. He says, you don't forgive me? So he says, No, I forgive you. He says, no, I see, you don't forgive me. He says, listen, the only way I'll know you forgive me is if you come to my apartment. I live here in Kiryat Sanz, and you'll come for cake and coffee, right? And then I'll know that you've forgiven me. So I'm going to figure, listen, he says, if I don't go with this guy, who knows, he'll give me a cup, so I'll go with him, and we'll have cake and coffee. So he goes, and this other guy, the guy who wants to kill himself, is schlepping along, and they go to this fellow's apartment, their cake and coffee. And as they're going, the fellow says to him, says, I see that you're a person who deals with people's problems. He has this guy with him. So he says, can I tell you, I have a problem. Can I tell you my problem? So he says, yeah. He says, yeah. He says, I have a daughter who needs a shidduch. Right? She's 27 years old. She needs a shidduch. Right? And maybe you can help. I said, okay. So Uncle Nicky meets her. Right? And he's a very nice girl, professional, and very, very fine midas, and good looking, and whatever. Okay, so he remembers he has this girl in Kiryat Sanz that needs a shidduch. 2 years later, so Mickey gets a phone call. He's at home, and he gets a call from a friend. It's like this. Now there's a fellow here in Yerushalayim who's going to America for a friend's wedding. And there used to be a flight Motzoi Shabbos. There was a flight left Israel Motzoi Shabbos. And he's scared that he's going to miss the flight because to get out of the city, nowadays it's much easier, but then the traffic was hard to get out of the city. So he's scared that if he has to get out of the city, he might miss the flight. He says, could he come to you for Shabbos? Could he come to you for Shabbos? And this way, Telstone is outside of the city. He's not much closer to the airport. So he says, sure, I'll come for Shabbos. So the fellow comes to Shabbos, and they're sitting there Friday night and talking, and he gets to know him, and he says, this guy is perfect for that girl in Kiryat Sanz in Netanya. So he says, but he can't remember the name of the family, who they were. Right? So how is he going to set this up? Anyway, so he says to the guy, I think I have a shidduch for you. So he says, I have no time. I'm taking this flight, Motzei Shabbos. So he says, listen, if I can arrange the date, right, would you be willing to push off your flight to Monday? So the guy says, yeah, I'd be willing to stay till Monday, but you have to tell me 10 minutes after the Zaman, Motzei Shabbos. Otherwise, I have to catch the... So Mick says, okay, listen, I'll arrange the date, 10 minutes, right? So he says, and if you... In other words, if you decide to stay, fine. Otherwise, I'll guarantee that I'll get you on a flight Monday. Okay. So he says, how am I going to arrange this in 10 minutes? I can't even remember her name. So Mickey is a genius, right? See, so he couldn't remember the family's name, but he remembered exactly how to get to their apartment, walking from the beach. So he calls up the emergency room in Laniado Hospital, right? And the girl answers the phone and he says, listen, this is Pikuach Nefesh. Pikuach Nefesh out, Pikuach Nefesh. He says, I'm going to send you to a address, and you have to tell them that they have to call me, Yerushalayim, at this number. And it's literally Pikuach Nefesh. And the girl buys it, right? And it gives the directions. Go here, take a right, a left, upstairs, this part. Go to that for a knock on the door, and tell them that Mickey Siratskin sends a message, you have to call him right away. 5 minutes later, right, they call him, right? And he says, I have a shidduch for your daughter. And sure enough, they went out, and he never went to America for the friend's wedding, and they got married, right? This is an amazing story. But the point is that this is the type of story which it is not a function of human effort at all. It's the kind of thing, it just doesn't make any sense at all, right? And sometimes, I genuinely believe that these things only fall into place when we've given up hope. When we tell ourselves that there is really nothing we can do. We can talk to Shadchanim, we can distribute resumes and go to shidduch meetings and do all these things, but really there's nothing we can do. We are in the Rebbeinu Shloim's hands, and then all of a sudden, the Yeshua, the salvation, comes, right? I'm not making an argument that we shouldn't be mishtabel. Sometimes the ishtabel makes sense. You have to know when the ishtadlus makes sense, and when it is just an act of desperation. When it's an act of desperation, we have to understand there's nothing we can do. We are in God's hands. If there's something we can do, we have to do it. When there's nothing we can do, then we know we're in God's hands, and perhaps that's the best place to be.